The broken silence. The Hong Kong temple breathed peace that morning. The sun filtered through the rice paper windows, drawing golden patterns on the polished wooden floor. In the center of the room, Bruce Lee was motionless, sitting in the lotus position, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and rhythmic. Each exhalation was a thread of energy that dissolved into the air, each inhale a return to emptiness. There were days when he sought absolute stillness, that state in which the mind detaches from the body and time ceases to exist. It was there, in the silence, that he found true strength, not in muscles, not in blows, but in the clarity of a spirit free from illusions. It was then that the door opened with a bang. Bruce Lee. The voice echoed, full of disdain. I heard that the great master was here, meditating like any other monk. Have you forgotten that you are a fighter? Bruce didn't move. He didn't open his eyes. Just breathed. The man who had entered was tall, broad, dressed in a silk kimono embroidered with golden dragons. His name was Chen Tao, undefeated full-contact champion on the Asian circuit, known for both his skill and his arrogance. He had traveled from Shanghai just to challenge the legendary Bruce Lee, certain that the little dragon was nothing more than a film artist with more fame than technique. Get up, ordered Chin, crossing his arms. Or are you afraid of facing someone who isn't a Hollywood actor? Bruce exhaled slowly. 8 seconds. That's how long it took for his eyes to open, calm, like the surface of a lake before a storm. You talk too much, he said, his voice calm. And he doesn't know how to listen. Chin laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. To hear? I came to fight, not to listen to sermons. Bruce stood up with the fluidity of a feline. There was no rush to his movements, just precision. Chen, impatient, rushed forward with a direct, fast, powerful punch, a blow that had already knocked down stronger opponents. Bruce dodged it with a slight movement of his head, as if brushing away a fly. Chen's fist passed inches from his face, but the momentum caused him to lose his balance. Before he could recover, Bruce spun around and threw a flying side kick that hit the champion in the chest with the force of a hammer. Chen flew backwards, his feet leaving the ground, and landed on his back with a thud. The air escaped his lungs in a groan. He tried to get up, but his legs were shaking, and the pain in his chest made him give up. He stood there, panting, eyes wide, trying to understand what had happened. Bruce returned to his meditation position, as if nothing had happened. 8 seconds, he murmured, closing his eyes again. That's how long it took you to learn the first lesson. True power is not in strength, but in control. Chen, humiliated, dragged himself out of the temple, leaving behind only the echo of his broken arrogance. And Bruce, motionless once again, smiled slightly. Because, for him, the real fight had never been against others. It was against ignorance itself. The fall and the rise. Chen dragged himself through the stone halls of the temple, shaking hands pressing to his chest, where throbbing pain spread like fire. Each breath was an effort, as if the air had turned into blades. He didn't understand. I had never been touched like that. I had never lost like that. The outer courtyard was empty, bathed in golden evening light. The younger disciples, who had previously watched him in awe, now looked away, embarrassed by their defeat. Chen stopped by a spring of clear water, where carp swam listlessly. He leaned over, wet his face, and saw his reflection distorted by the ripples, red eyes, cracked lips, shattered pride. 8 seconds. Bruce's words echoed in his mind like a whip. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palm until he drew blood. It wasn't possible. He had trained for years, mastered techniques that made experienced warriors recoil. And yet, a man sitting motionless had knocked him down without even getting up. A shadow moved to his left. Chen looked up, ready to attack, but it was only Li Wei, the temple's oldest disciple, the one who always carried a serene smile and a wisdom that irritated Chen more than any insult. You are hurt, the Li Wei said, without judgment, just observation. Chen spat on the ground, the taste of blood still in his mouth. I don't need your pity. It's not a pity. It's observation. Li Wei walked over, offering a small bag of herbs. This will ease the pain. And the swelling. Chen hesitated, but eventually accepted. Li Wei's hands were steady, not trembling, not in a hurry. As he applied the ointment to Chen's chest, he spoke softly. Bruce is not like other masters. He doesn't teach techniques. Teaches limits. Limits? Chen laughed bitterly. He showed me that I don't have any. No. He showed that you don't know yours. Li Wei finished wrapping the bandage and took a step back. Brute force is like a flood, it destroys everything in its path, but it doesn't last. True power is like a river. Find your course, shape the earth, and remain. Chen wanted to scream, curse, break something. But Li Wei's words hit him like a silent punch. He remembered all the times he had won fights through sheer violence, how his opponents fell before they even understood what had hit them. And yet, there he was, fallen by a man who hadn't even raised his hand. What do I do now? The question escaped before he could stop it. It wasn't a plea. It was an admission. Li Wei smiled, as if he had expected this. You come back. And asks to learn. Chen did not return that day. Not the next one. He spent a week wandering in the mountains around the temple, sleeping in damp caves, eating roots and wild fruits. The initial anger gave way to a restlessness that gnawed at him inside. He trained alone, repeating the same movements he had mastered for years, but now every strike felt empty, every stance a lie. One night, as he watched the fire crackle, he realized something terrible. It wasn't getting better. He was just getting tired. And for the first time in his life, he felt afraid. Not of failure, but of the possibility that he would never be more than that, a strong man, but not wise, feared but not respected. On the 8th day, he returned. The temple was silent, as always. Bruce was sitting in the same spot, motionless, as if he hadn't moved since the last time. Chen stopped a few steps away, his hands sweaty, his heart pounding. Master, he said, his voice hoarse. I want to learn. Bruce opened his eyes. There was no surprise in his gaze, just a stillness that made Chen feel small. You've already started. Chen frowned. Like this? The first lesson wasn't about control. It was about humility. Bruce stood up with a fluidity that belied his age, approaching Chen. You thought you knew what power was. Now you know that you don't know. This is the beginning. Chen swallowed. And the next lesson? Bruce smiled but didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to the floor. Sit down. Chen obeyed, crossing his legs with difficulty, the pain in his chest still present. Bruce sat in front of him, hands resting on his knees. Close your eyes. Chen hesitated, but did as asked. Darkness enveloped him, and for a moment, he thought he might faint. But then he heard Bruce's voice, low and firm. Breathe. And so it began. Months passed. Chen learned that true training wasn't about punches or defenses, but about listening. Listen to your own body, your own mind, the world around you. He spent entire days sitting in meditation, feeling the pain in his legs, the itching of his skin, the weight of his own thoughts. He learned not to react. Not fighting the discomfort, but observing it, like a passing cloud. Bruce tested him in unexpected ways. Sometimes it was a sudden push while Chen was distracted. Other times, it was a simple question, what do you see? While pointing to a tree, a bird, his own reflection in the water. Chen was wrong. I was wrong a lot. But, little by little, he began to understand. One night, during a storm, Bruce took him to the roof of the temple. The rain fell in thick sheets, the wind howled, and lightning illuminated the valley below like sheets of light. Stand up, Bruce ordered. Chen obeyed, his bare feet slipping on the wet tiles. The wind pushed him, threatening to knock him over, but he stood firm, his muscles tense, his breathing controlled. "Now," said Bruce, "don't fight the wind. Let him pass through you." Chen frowned, confused. But then, slowly, he relaxed his shoulders. Instead of resisting the force of the wind, he leaned forward slightly, as if he was dancing with it. And, to his surprise, he didn't fall. Bruce smiled. Power is not in weathering the storm. It's in not being broken by it. Years later, Chen became a master. Not in the traditional sense, he had no disciples, he didn't teach, he didn't compete in tournaments. But those who knew him knew there was something different about him. He didn't move like the other fighters. He didn't attack with fury, he didn't defend with rigidity. It was like water, fluid, adaptable, impossible to contain. One day, a young warrior arrived at the temple, full of arrogance, challenging anyone to a duel. Chen watched him for a while, in silence, before approaching. "You fight well," said the young man, evaluating him. "But I'm faster." Chen smiled. "Then show me." The young man attacked with impressive speed, his fists cutting through the air. Chen didn't move. At the last second, he dodged with the slightest movement, and the blow grazed his shoulder. The young man tried again, and again, and again, each attack more furious than the last. But Chen didn't fight. He just was. And then, without warning, the young man stopped, panting, eyes wide. "How?" Chen didn't respond. Instead, he reached out and touched the young man's shoulder, as Bruce had done to him years before. 8 seconds, he said softly. "That's how long it took you to learn your first lesson." The young man fell to his knees, not out of pain, but out of understanding. And Chen finally understood. The true victory was not over the other. It was about himself. The weight of the void. The young man remained on his knees, his hands resting on the dirt floor of the monastery courtyard. Sweat dripped down his temple, mixing with the dust that rose with each panting breath. He wasn't crying, it wasn't weakness he felt, but something deeper, a chink in the armor he'd carried for as long as he could remember. Chen watched him silently, his arms crossed, his body still as a stone statue. There was no triumph in his eyes, just the stillness of someone who had already walked that path. 8 seconds, repeated the young man, his voice hoarse. "That's what you said." Chen nodded. "The time it took you to realize you were fighting yourself." The young man raised his face. His eyes, once flaming with anger, now shone with something he couldn't name. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was relief. "I don't understand." "You understand," Chen said, extending his hand to help him up. "He just doesn't want to accept it." The young man hesitated before taking the offered hand. When he stood up, he felt the weight of his own body in a new way, as if every muscle, every bone, carried a secret that he had always known, but had never dared to decipher. He looked around, the stone walls of the monastery, the darkening sky to the west, the other disciples training in the distance, oblivious to what had just happened. No one there seemed to have noticed the change. But he knew. Something inside him had broken. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. "My name is Li Wei," said the young man, as if the words were a confession. Chen smiled slightly. "I know." Li Wei frowned. "How?" "You screamed his name 3 times before attacking." Chen shrugged. "A warrior who announces his identity before battle is not ready to fight." Li Wei blushed. It wasn't just the shame of having been heard, but the realization that, in his rush to prove something, he had revealed much more than he intended. Chen didn't need words to see through him. One look was enough. "What do you want from me?" Li Wei asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Nothing," Chen replied. "You already have what you need." "And what is it?" "A start. The path of scars." The following days were a blur for Li Wei. He would wake up before dawn, like everyone else in the monastery, and join the other disciples in meditation and training practices. But, unlike them, he didn't seek to perfect strikes or strengthen his body. I watched. He watched Chen, who moved among the students like a shadow, correcting postures with a touch, answering questions with silence. He observed the elders, who carried on their bodies the marks of past battles, scars that told stories without words. He observed himself, in the reflection of the bronze mirrors of the training hall, trying to understand what had changed. On the 7th day, he found Chen alone in the rock garden, sweeping up fallen leaves with a slow, almost ritualistic movement. "Why don't you fight?" Li Wei asked bluntly. Chen stopped, leaning on the broomstick. "I fight. Not like the others. You don't move. Don't fight back. Because the real fight is not against an opponent." Chen began sweeping again, the broom bristles sliding over the stones with a soft sound. "It is against the illusion that there is an adversary." Li Wei crossed his arms. "That doesn't make sense." "Do it," Chen said, without looking at him. "You just don't want me to." Li Wei felt the anger return, but this time it was different. It wasn't the blind fury that had led him to attack Chen days before, but something more controlled, like a slow-burning flame. He took a deep breath. "Show me." Chen stopped again. This time, she turned to him, her dark eyes fixed on his. "You already know how." "I don't know." "He knows." Chen left the broom aside and walked towards him, stopping a step away. "Close your eyes." Li Wei hesitated but complied. The world around her disappeared, the sound of birds, the smell of damp earth, even the feel of the wind on her skin. All that was left was the darkness and, within it, the racing rhythm of his own heart. "What do you see?" Chen asked. "Nothing." "Lie." Chen's voice was calm but firm. "You see the fear." Li Wei suddenly opened his eyes. "I'm not afraid." "He has." Chen touched Li Wei's chest, just above the heart. "Here." "Fear of not being good enough. Fear of failing. Fear that, in the end, everything you are is nothing more than an illusion." Li Wei recoiled, as if the words had physically hit him. "How do you know?" "Because I've felt the same way." Chen lowered his hand. "We all feel it." Li Wei looked at his hands, as if he expected to find in them the answer to something he didn't know how to formulate. Then, without warning, it attacked. It wasn't a calculated blow, like the ones he practiced in training. It was a raw movement, loaded with everything he couldn't say. Chen dodged it easily, but this time he didn't stay still. He moved fast, precise, and in an instant, Li Wei was on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back, his face pressed into the dirt. "You're still fighting yourself," Chen said, his voice close to his ear. "But now it's closer." Li Wei did not respond. He remained there, motionless, feeling the weight of Chen's body on his own, his warm breath against the back of his neck. There was no pain, just a strange feeling of completeness, as if, for the first time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chen released him and walked away. Li Wei slowly stood up, wiping the dirt off his face. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Chen picked up the broom again. "Keep sweeping." The last lesson. Weeks passed, and Li Wei learned that true discipline lay not in blows, but in silence. He swept the yard every morning, tended the rock garden, helped in the kitchen. He no longer asked about techniques or secrets. "I knew the answers would come when I was ready." One night, while the other disciples were sleeping, he found Chen sitting on the edge of the cliff overlooking the valley. The full moon illuminated the master's face, highlighting the expression lines that told of years of a life that Li Wei could only imagine. "Can I join you?" he asked. Chen didn't respond. He just patted the space next to him. Li Wei sat down, letting his legs dangle over the abyss. The wind was blowing strong, bringing the smell of the distant mountains. "I understand," Li Wei said, after a long silence. "Understand what?" "That there is no victory." Not like I thought. Chen smiled. There is. It's just not what you expected. Li Wei looked at him, expecting more. But Chen said nothing. They stood there, side by side, watching the valley plunged into darkness, until the first lights of dawn began to dye the sky pink. What happens now? Li Wei finally asked. Chen stood up, extending his hand to help him up. Now, he said, you teach someone what you learned. Li Wei looked at the offered hand, then at Chen's serene face. And for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. Just peace.